The iron door shrieked open, and the stench rushed forth. A putrid marriage of human waste, rotting straw, and the sweet, sour reek of infection. In the bowels of Newgate Prison, London, 1419, torchlight danced against walls slick with condensation and filth. A woman's scream tore through the darkness, not of pain, but of rage, raw, primal, defiant. Lady Eleanor Cobham knelt in the corner of her cell, her silk gown now a tattered shroud caked with refuse. The hem, once embroidered with golden thread by the finest seamstresses of Westminster, trailed through excrement and sodden straw. Her hands, those same hands that had once held the Duke of Gloucester's face, that had signed letters with sealing wax the color of blood, now clawed at stone walls, searching for purchase, for dignity, for anything solid in a world that had dissolved beneath her. The jailer's keys jangled. His shadow fell across her like a sentence. She had been a duchess, the paramour of a prince, a woman who whispered into the ear of power itself. Now, she was property of the crown's cruelty, locked in a tomb for the living, where women were not prisoners, but specimens of moral instruction, living warnings carved in flesh and degradation. What sin had she committed to warrant this descent? What crime transforms a noble woman into carrion? Act 1. The royal world before it broke. 3 years earlier, the palace at Westminster gleamed with autumn light. Tapestries depicting the conquest of France billowed gently in the breeze from open casements, their silk threads catching fire in the afternoon sun. The scent of beeswax and lavender permeated the corridors, mingling with the earthy aroma of rushes strewn across stone floors. In these halls, power moved with the rustle of velvet and the soft percussion of jeweled slippers against marble. Eleanor Cobham walked these corridors as though she owned them. Perhaps, in a way, she did. As the mistress, and later the wife, of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, she inhabited a world of crystalline goblets filled with hippocras, of private chapels where prayers were whispered in Latin so pure it seemed to polish the very air. She was learned, unusually so for a woman of her station. Great ladies of the realm, the Duchess of Bedford, the Countess of Warwick, regarded Eleanor with eyes like drawn daggers. They smiled at her across banquet tables, laden with swan and peacock, their lips forming pleasantries, while their gazes promised retribution. Yet Eleanor thrived in this atmosphere of elegant hostility. She understood the geometry of court politics, the careful calculations of alliance and enmity. She knew that her husband stood third in line to the throne, and that King Henry VI, pious and scholarly to the point of unworldliness, had yet to produce an heir. The mathematics of succession hung in the air like incense, intoxicating, dangerous, impossible to ignore. In her private chambers, Eleanor consulted with men whose names were spoken only in whispers. Thomas Southwell, a canon of St. Stephen's Chapel. Roger Bolingbroke, an Oxford scholar whose knowledge of the stars was matched only by his understanding of darker arts. Marjorie Jourdemain, the Witch of Eye, whose potions and charms had eased the bodies and troubled the minds of half the nobility of London. They came to her apartments through side doors, their visits timed to coincide with the Duke's absences. They brought with them instruments of brass and copper, charts covered in arcane symbols, vials containing substances that shimmered with unnatural luminescence. What did they discuss in those candlelit sessions? What questions did Eleanor pose? And what answers did these practitioners of forbidden knowledge provide? The court noticed. Of course they noticed. At Westminster, secrets had the lifespan of frost in sunlight. But noticing and proving were different creatures entirely. Cardinal Beaufort, the Duke's bitter enemy, watched from the shadows of the Great Council. He waited, patient as a serpent in winter, for Eleanor to overstep, for her ambition to write its own indictment. On an October evening in 1440, as Eleanor stood at her chamber window watching darkness swallow the Thames, she felt the first tremor of premonition. The candles behind her flickered, though no breeze stirred. In the courtyard below, a raven landed on the stones and fixed her with an obsidian eye before taking flight. She turned from the window, her hand unconsciously moving to her throat, where a pendant, a wound opening. Treasonable necromancy. The words themselves were a sentence, not merely witchcraft. That alone might merit penance, public humiliation, a fine. But treasonable. The modifier transformed everything, elevated her alleged crimes from the realm of female weakness and spiritual delusion into the territory of high treason, of conspiracy against the crown itself. They had found the wax doll. In a chamber belonging to Marjorie Jourdemain, the king's men had discovered an effigy fashioned in beeswax, inscribed with symbols and pierced with pins. It bore, they claimed, a resemblance to young King Henry VI. The implication was clear, damning, irrefutable in its symbolism. Eleanor had sought to murder the king through sorcery, to clear the path for her husband's ascension to the throne. The trial that followed was spectacle and predetermination woven into a single tapestry of destruction. In the ecclesiastical court at Westminster Hall, Eleanor stood before her accusers, bishops whose faces were carved from sanctimony, nobles whose political calculations showed naked in their eyes. The vaulted ceiling soared above her, its stonework seeming to press downward with the weight of divine judgment. Roger Bolingbroke broke first. Under torture, the rack's methodical stretching of sinew and joint, the slow dislocation of shoulders from their sockets, he confessed to everything. Yes, they had cast the king's horoscope. Yes, they had sought to divine the hour of his death. Yes, the Duchess of Gloucester had commissioned these forbidden inquiries. His words, extracted through agony, became her damnation. Marjorie Jourdemain followed, the Witch of Eye, who had tended to the intimate ailments of half the noble ladies of London, who had provided love philters and fertility charms and potions to ease childbed pain. She too confessed. Under the shadow of the stake, with the smell of burning pitch already seeming to permeate the courtroom, she admitted to fashioning the wax image, to performing rituals of maleficium, to acts of diabolical congress. Thomas Southwell died in the Tower before he could testify, found cold in his cell one November morning. Whether his death was natural, or whether powerful hands had silenced him to prevent further revelations, remained a question whispered but never answered. Eleanor herself was permitted no such escape. She stood before the court in a simple gown for their transgressions. But her words fell into a void of predetermined judgment. The court cared nothing for the distinction between seeking knowledge and seeking murder. To inquire into the king's death, even theoretically, was to wish for it. To calculate through astrology when he might die was to desire his death's hastening. In the logic of treason, thought and deed were indistinguishable. The Duke of Gloucester, her husband, the man who had promised eternal devotion, did not attend the trial. Political necessity had transformed him into a ghost. To defend Eleanor was to implicate himself, to suggest complicity in her alleged crimes. He remained in his chambers, a prisoner of his own ambition, while his wife faced judgment alone. The sentence was pronounced on a grey November day. Eleanor would be stripped of her title and lands. She would perform public penance, walking barefoot through the streets of London, carrying a taper of wax, dressed in the garments of shame. And then, when the public humiliation had satisfied the realm's appetite for spectacle, she would be imprisoned for life, at the king's pleasure. As the judgment was read, Eleanor's face remained a mask of noble composure, but those closest to her saw the minute tremor at the corner of her mouth, the way her fingers crushed the fabric of her gown until the knuckles whitened. She had climbed so high, had nearly touched the summit of power itself. Now she would descend into darkness. Outside the court, Roger Bolingbroke was already being prepared for execution. He would be hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn, his body dismembered and displayed as warning to others who might traffic in forbidden arts. Marjorie Jourdemain would burn at Smithfield, her screams echoing across the city as flames consumed flesh that had once been vibrant with life and purpose. But Eleanor would live. That was her particular punishment: to endure, to remember, to exist as a cautionary tale wrapped in slowly decaying flesh. The public penance came first. 3 times, Eleanor walked barefoot through London's streets. a lit taper clutched in her hands, while crowds gathered to witness the fallen duchess's humiliation. Children threw refuse, women spat, men jeered and called her whore, witch, traitor. The cobblestones tore at her feet until blood marked her passage, a crimson trail through the city that had once acclaimed her beauty and grace. Downward into depths where sunlight had never penetrated. The air grew thick, resistant, as though the atmosphere itself had curdled into something barely breathable. Eleanor's guards, men whose faces betrayed neither pity nor cruelty, only the blank efficiency of those who serve power, propelled her forward with hands that gripped her arms like manacles. The women's ward existed in perpetual twilight, torches guttered in iron sconces, their smoke adding another layer to air already dense with human effluvia. The floor was not floor, but compressed filth. Straw that had rotted into a kind of organic mortar, mixed with excrement, vomit, menstrual blood. The detritus of bodies no longer granted the dignity of privacy or sanitation. Eleanor's cell measured perhaps 6 feet by 8. 3 women already occupied it. The first was a skeletal creature, whose name had been lost to madness. She sat in the corner, rocking ceaselessly, her lips moving in prayers or curses, the words too fragmented to distinguish meaning. Her hair had fallen out in patches, revealing scalp marked with sores that wept yellow fluid. The smell of infection radiated from her like heat from coals. The second was younger, perhaps 20, her face still retaining traces of beauty beneath the grime. She had murdered her husband, or so the jailer said with a lascivious wink, caught him with another woman and put a kitchen knife through his eye. She sat with her back against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes fixed on some distant point that existed only in memory. The third was a child, no more than 14, arrested for theft. She had stolen bread from a baker's stall to feed her siblings. Her wrists bore the marks of iron fetters, the skin rubbed raw and weeping. She looked at Eleanor with eyes that contained no hope, only a kind of terrible acceptance. "Welcome to the sisterhood," the young murderess said, her voice hoarse. "Mind the corner there. That's where the rats come through. They're bold at night." The door clanged shut. The sound reverberated through Eleanor's chest like a funeral bell. There was no bed, no pallet, no concession to human comfort. The women slept where the keys that opened doors and expectations that required no key at all. The young murderess learned to make herself small, to disappear into shadows, to become invisible through sheer force of will. Sometimes it worked. Often it did not. Eleanor heard her the first night, the sounds of struggle, of pleading that dissolved into whimpers, of the jailer's grunting satisfaction. Afterward, the girl returned to the cell and sat in her corner, silent, methodically wiping blood and other fluids from her thighs with a handful of straw. "You'll learn," she whispered to Eleanor in the darkness. "You'll learn that your body isn't yours anymore. Nothing is yours. Not even your screams." Eleanor wanted to offer comfort, to rage against the injustice, to summon the authority she had once possessed. But she was duchess no longer. She was merely female, merely flesh, merely another commodity in the economy of masculine power that governed these depths. The child died on Eleanor's 10th day in Newgate, an infection that started in her wrist, where the fetters had carved through skin, spread upward through her arm. The flesh swelled, turned colors that Eleanor had never seen on living tissue. Purple, black, a greenish yellow that seemed to glow with internal corruption. Fever consumed her. She babbled about her mother, about hunger, about angels coming to take her home. The jailer refused to call a physician. "She's bound for the noose anyway," he said with a shrug. "Why waste coin on the condemned?" She died curled on her side, making small mewling sounds like a kitten. Eleanor held her as the life drained away, feeling the child's body grow cold in her arms. When the jailer finally came to remove the corpse, he complained about the added labor, about having to arrange burial in the pit outside the prison walls, where the unclaimed dead were thrown into lime-filled trenches. "Another dead whore," he muttered, dragging the small body by one ankle. "The city breeds them like rats." In the weeks that followed, Eleanor learned the architecture of despair. She learned that dignity was a luxury purchased with status, and that status evaporated the moment iron doors closed. She learned that the female body, in the eyes of those who governed these spaces, was terrain to be occupied, resource to be her back and thighs, festering welts that she could not properly tend in the absence of clean water or medicinal herbs. Yet she endured. Something in her, some core of will that had propelled her from minor nobility to duchess, refused to surrender. She recited poetry in her mind, walked through the rooms of Westminster in memory, reconstructed conversations with scholars and philosophers. Her mind became her final fortress, the one territory the jailers could not invade. Months dissolved into an undifferentiated stream of suffering. Time lost meaning when each day was identical to the last. The same darkness, the same hunger, the same violation of body and spirit. Eleanor began to understand that this was the point. The punishment was not merely confinement, but erasure. They sought to unmake her, to reduce the Duchess to animal, to prove that without title and wealth, a woman was nothing but meat. When the order finally came to transfer her to Chester Castle, Eleanor had been in Newgate for 7 months. 7 months that had aged her a decade. 7 months that had taught her truths about power and gender that no court education could have provided. As they led her up the stairs toward daylight, she stumbled, her legs weakened by months of confinement, her eyes burning in sunlight that seemed impossibly bright. Behind her, the women's ward continued its dark work, grinding new arrivals into submission, teaching them the price of being female and powerless in a world ordered by masculine authority. The young murderess called out as Eleanor departed. "Remember us," she shouted, her voice echoing off stone walls. "Remember that we were here, that we existed." Eleanor turned, met her eyes one final time, and nodded. She would remember. How could she forget? Act 4. The unanswered question. Eleanor Cobham would live another 16 years in captivity, moving between fortress prisons, Chester, Kenilworth, the Isle of Man, each progressively more remote, more isolated. She died in 1452, still a prisoner. Her name by then a whisper, a cautionary tale told to ambitious women who forgot their station. But the question that haunted her final years was never answered. Had she truly conspired against the king? The wax effigy, the astrological calculations, strengthening Cardinal Beaufort, warning other women against the sin of aspiration. Perhaps Eleanor was guilty. Perhaps she did commission murder through sorcery, did conspire against the crown, did transgress every boundary of permissible female behavior. Or perhaps she was simply a woman who reached too high, whose intelligence and ambition marked her as dangerous in a world that demanded female submission. What remains certain is this: the punishment for her alleged crimes was designed not merely to imprison, but to unmake, to demonstrate that a woman's body, once stripped of status and protection, became property of the state, to be degraded, violated, erased. Medieval prisons for women were not simply spaces of confinement, but laboratories of gendered punishment, where the machinery of masculine authority inscribed its dominance directly onto female flesh. Eleanor's story is not unique. Thousands of women passed through Newgate, through the Fleet, through the countless prisons that dotted medieval England. Their names are lost, their suffering unrecorded. They existed in the margins of history, their stories preserved only in the fragmentary records of court proceedings and the ledgers of jailers. But Eleanor's prominence grants her the dubious immortality of documentation. Through her, we glimpse the horror that was ordinary, the brutality that was standard practice, the violation that was simply another Tuesday in the women's ward. The Duchess of Gloucester entered Newgate in silk and emeralds. She emerged in rags, her body bearing scars that no royal pardon could heal, her mind carrying memories that no passage of time could erase. Was she guilty? The question echoes across 5 centuries, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. But guilty or innocent, no woman deserved what medieval justice inflicted in the name of order, morality, and masculine supremacy. The iron door of Newgate closed behind countless women. Most never emerged. Their bones rest in unmarked graves, their stories dissolved into the silence that history reserves for the powerless. Eleanor Cobham's story survives, a monument to ambition punished, to power's cruelty, to the specific horrors reserved for women who dared to reach beyond their prescribed sphere. In the darkness of that cell, surrounded by suffering she could neither prevent nor escape, did Eleanor regret her ambition? Did she wish she